The Australia-English rivalry, as a result of the Ashes, took cricket to the next level in standards. And England and Australia clearly were the top two teams in the early part of the 20th century. However, as the 1950s dawned, a third country, which actually comprised several independent island nations in the Caribbean, started emerging as a genuine competitor to both England and Australia. I'm talking about the West Indies. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we start in the 1950s and look at how cricket evolved over the next few decades. So while we are in the 1950s, let's start with July of 1956, when history was made during the fourth test of the England-Australia Ashes series at Old Trafford, Manchester. Coming into the fourth test, both teams were tied at one game each, but one spinner on the English side swayed the game and the series England's way. The bowler, Jim Laker, and his achievement, 9 wickets in the first innings and 10 in the second, ending up with 19 wickets for 90 runs in the match to get England to victory by an innings and 170 runs. But the feat of taking 19 wickets in one test match remains unbeaten to this day. Moving on to the West Indies, which started emerging as a force in international cricket. It started around about in the 1930s, specifically 1935, when West Indies won a test series against England. Now, the origin of cricket in the West Indies is full of racial undertones. Initially, it was dominated by the colonial masters, and the black natives were just responsible for throwing and retrieving the ball from the fields, which ultimately led to the native blacks owning the bowling department, whereas the colonial masters, the white players, monopolized batting. But stereotypes are stereotypes, and all this changed in the 1930s as the West Indies had its first black top-order batsman, George Headley. Batting at number 3, George Headley scored an unbeaten 270 in the final test against England at Jamaica to get the West Indies to victory over England by an innings and 161 runs and win the series 2-1. The 1950s was a turbulent time for the West Indies politically because there was a growing demand for autonomy from the colonial empire. And amidst this turbulence, an ethnically diverse West Indies team started on a tour of England in June of 1950 to play a 4-test series. It comprised 3 top-order native West Indian batsmen, Everton Weekes, Frank Worrell, and Clyde Walcott, who would go on to be known as the 3 Ws of West Indies. And along with them was spinner Sonny Ramdeen of East Indian descent. After losing the first test at Manchester by 202 runs, the West Indies went on to win the second test at Lord's by 326 runs, thanks mainly to an outstanding spell of bowling by spinners Sonny Ramdeen and Alf Valentine. Between the two of them, they took 18 wickets across the 2 innings, and they were supplemented by an outstanding knock of 168 not out by Clyde Walcott. The West Indies had registered their first win on English soil, and they would go on to win the series 3-1. Now, this win ended up being a huge morale and confidence booster across the West Indies. And as a result, the demand for self-determination and independence from England became more intense. Ultimately, in 1958, England agreed to grant federation status to the West Indies. So the independence and all was great, but on the cricket field, West Indies were still being led by a white captain. Now, contrary to other sports like basketball, soccer, etc., where the coach is the center stage and responsible for the success or failure of a team, in cricket, it is the captain who bears that mantle and not the coach. And that is primarily because there's a lot of activity that goes on in the middle, which is very difficult for the coach to control. And in case of the West Indies, the one player who was displaying the leadership qualities needed in a captain was Frank Worrell. And when Frank Worrell stepped in as the captain in 1960, his immediate task was to make his countrymen believe that just as they could govern themselves, they could also lead themselves in cricket. Since their epic victory in 1950 against England, West Indies had had several losses against England and Australia. So Frank Worrell had the responsibility of turning that around. So he picked up a well-balanced side with Conrad Hunt and Rohan Kanhai as the top order batters, Wes Hall as the pace bowler, and a brilliant young all-rounder, Gary Sobers, who had already knocked the highest individual score of 365 not out against Pakistan 2 years back. And Jerry Alexander, the white captain who had led West Indies earlier, was retained as the wicketkeeper. In December of 1960, Frank Worrell and his team landed in Australia to play a 5-test series. The two sides met in Brisbane on December 9, 1960, and the Aussies were led by Richie Benaud. West Indies scored a decent 453 in the first innings, thanks to a century by Gary Sobers and a captain's knock of 65 by Frank Worrell. In reply, Australia scored 505 thanks to a brilliant 92 by Bob Simpson and an outstanding 181 by Norman O'Neill. In their second innings, Australia needed 233 to win the match. There were several twists and turns, and ultimately, Australia needed 5 runs from the last 7 balls with 3 wickets in hand. Last 7 balls because we are talking about an Australian over, which at that time comprised 8 balls. And Wes Hall was bowling the last over. Richie Benaud fell to Wes Hall trying to hook a bouncer, so Australia now needed 5 runs in 6 balls with 2 wickets in hand. There was a run-out chance miss, a catch dropped, and ultimately, with 3 balls to go, Australia needed 3 runs to win with 2 wickets in hand. The 6th ball was played by Ian McKeff into the deep, and he took off for 3 runs. But Wally Grout was unable to complete the 3rd run because of a sharp throw from Conrad Hunt, which led to his run out. The scores were now tied with only 1 wicket in hand. Lindsay Klein played the 7th ball towards square leg and immediately took off for a single. The West Indies fielder at square leg, Joe Solomon, had just 1 wicket to aim at, and he found his mark with a direct hit, and Ian McKeff was declared run out. The world had witnessed the first tied test in the history of cricket. For the Australian spectator, this was an amazing bout of entertainment, and as a result, the West Indian cricket team won a lot of accolades for proving to be worthy opponents to the Australians. The team got a massive reception at Melbourne ahead of their second test. Overall, the West Indies lost the series 2-1, but still won the hearts of a lot of Australians for the entertaining and competitive brand of cricket they played. Frank Worrell went on to win a test series in England 3-1 in his farewell tour in 1963. By now, the West Indies had cemented their place as one of the top teams in international cricket. And Frank Worrell is often credited with molding the team into a top performer. Now, around this time, another team was slowly making its mark on international cricket. That was South Africa. But there was one problem. They were deliberately banning any black players from being part of the team. So much so that one prolific batsman, Basil de Oliveira, had to migrate to England to get a chance to play cricket. And as South Africa's rugby team toured England and Australia in the early 70s, there were widespread disruptions of games in protest against apartheid in South Africa. And because of these tensions, England and Australia cancelled the planned tours of South Africa. And instead, in 1971, Australia invited a World 11, which was multiracial in composition, to participate in a 5-test series against Australia. World 11 were led by West Indian Gary Sobers and included players like Rohan Kanhai and Clive Lloyd from the West Indies, Sunil Gavaskar, Farooq Engineer and Bishan Singh Bedi from India, Zahir Abbas and Intikhab Alam from Pakistan, and Graham Pollock from South Africa. The Australian side was led by Ian Chappell and included players like Greg Chappell, Rodney Marsh, and an upcoming fast bowler who would go on to be considered one of the greatest fast bowlers in the history of the game, Dennis Lillee. In the second test at Perth, Dennis Lillee had the World 11 all out for 59, taking 8 wickets for 29 runs in the World 11 first innings. In the second innings, after following on, World 11 managed 279 runs, thanks mainly to a knock of 118 from Rohan Kanhai. Once again, Dennis Lillee was the top wicket taker with 4 for 63, as Australia won the game by an innings and 11 runs. But despite their loss in the second test, the World 11 truly displayed the spirit of the game as World 11. I say that because during the second test, India and Pakistan were at war. So while they were in the pavilion, players from both India and Pakistan were glued to their radio sets for news from home. But in the middle, there was complete camaraderie and team spirit across the World 11. An amazing example of sports transcending political boundaries. The third test at Melbourne is remembered for one of the finest innings played on Australian soil. The innings of 254 by Gary Sobers. Sir Gary virtually toyed with Dennis Lillee's field placements, elegantly guiding his strokes between several fielders who looked helpless as Lillee grew frustrated with the outcome. World 11 went on to win the game by 96 runs and the 5-test series 2-1. Meanwhile, apartheid continued and South Africa was banned from international cricket in 1970. During the 1970 Ashes series in Australia, the third test at Melbourne had to be abandoned due to 3 days of incessant rain. Now, the authorities did not want to lose money, so they decided to host a one-day exhibition match, which was 40 overs a side. Now, mind you, 40 Australian overs, which meant approximately 53 overs with the 6 balls in the over. The spectators loved the change, and subsequently, the first World Cup cricket with limited overs, which was 60 standard overs a side, was held in England in 1975. West Indies met Australia in the finals on June 21st. West Indies, batting first, scored 291 for 8, thanks to an outstanding knock of 102 off just 85 balls by captain Clive Lloyd. Australia, in reply, seemed to be cruising along at 81 for 1 when a young West Indian fielder, Vivian Richards, engineered 3 runouts to turn the game West Indies' way, and West Indies finally lifted the cup with a 17-run victory over Australia. The crowds at the final were massive, and that gave a good indicator to the administrators that the one-day format was there to stay in the long run. Interestingly, in this era, cricketers had day jobs because cricket was really paying them a pittance. Cricketers used to take time off from work to play cricket. And the cricketers had, across the various test-playing countries, tried hard to negotiate an increase in pay, but without success. And just to get an idea of the scale of the problem, Australia was having collections around $250,000 per test match, whereas the players were being paid $200 per head for each test match. So the board was paying $2,400 to the players and earning $250,000. And with the advent of colour television, Test cricket had more and more TV spectators, and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, or ABC, was seeing great returns. And in 1976, Channel 9's Kerry Packer put forth a bid of $1.5 million for broadcast rights for cricket for the next 3 years. ABC refused because Packer apparently did not have experience in sports broadcasting. Packer upped his bid, but he was still refused. Frustrated, he decided to start a cricket league of his own, and he named it World Series Cricket. And very well aware of the pittance the cricketers were getting from their respective boards, Packer started signing top cricketers across the globe at very high prices. ICC was alarmed at this development and requested the local boards to ban these cricketers. Kerry Packer formed 3 teams towards World Series Cricket: Australia, West Indies, and World 11. Australia were led by Ian Chappell and had players like Greg Chappell, Dennis Lillee, Jeff Thomson, and Kepler Wessels in their side. West Indies 11 were led by Clive Lloyd and had players like Gordon Greenidge, Desmond Haynes, Andy Roberts, Rohan Kanhai, and Vivian Richards. World 11 were led by England's Tony Greig and had players like Asif Iqbal, Richard Hadley, Imran Khan, Javed Miandad, Barry Richards, and Clive Rice. For the Channel 9 viewers, it was an ultimate delight watching the top players compete in this forum. The Australian Cricket Board was not giving Kerry Packer any cricket stadiums to host his games in, so Packer used drop-in pitches in rugby and soccer stadiums to create a cricket venue. The games comprised of 5-day tests called super tests, since they were not allowed to use the term test match, and 1-day limited over games of 40 Australian overs aside. The first season of the World Series was the 1977 season, which was extremely successful. Around the time the 1978-79 season started, Australia was hosting India for a test series, and there was concern that Kerry Packer would lose spectators to this official ICC test series. So he decided to play World Series cricket at night. Yes, the concept of night cricket started with Kerry Packer. The night cricket was played under floodlights, had a white ball, and coloured jerseys. Australians wore yellow, West Indies pink, and rest of the world blue. The white ball was used to avoid a clash with the colourful jerseys. And cricketers could wear helmets as protective gear. The night cricket actually saw more crowds because the fans could come to the stadium after their workday. And as the crowd enthusiasm towards the World Series cricket increased, at the same time it decreased for the official ICC cricket matches because of lack of top-class players in those tournaments. And with the writing on the wall, in May of 1979, the Australian Cricket Board finally relented and gave Kerry Packer a much better deal with respect to cricket broadcasting rights. Packer agreed on condition that none of his players would be penalized and would be subsequently reinstated in their respective teams. Looking back, with respect to entertainment, players' compensation, and broadcasting, Kerry Packer was the biggest disruptor in modern-day cricket. In 1980, the 8-ball over in Australia was abolished and the 6-ball over was made universal across the globe. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. 9 Indians are in the ICC Hall of Fame for cricket, and there is one Indian in that list from the 1940s through 50s era. Who is that Indian? Among the finest all-rounders to ever come from India, Vinu Mankad was inducted into the ICC Hall of Fame in 2021. So the answer is B, Vinu Mankad. Question for the current episode. Based on win percentage, who is rated as the most successful Test cricket captain in history? Is it A, Graeme Smith of South Africa, B, MS Dhoni of India, C, Clive Lloyd of West Indies, or D, Steve Waugh of Australia? Once again, based on the win percentage, who is rated as the most successful Test cricket captain in history? Is it A, Graeme Smith of South Africa, B, MS Dhoni of India, C, Clive Lloyd of West Indies, or D, Steve Waugh of Australia? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we get a little serious and take a look at the 2 most powerful authoritarian leaders in the world today, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. We'll take a look at their origins and their trajectory towards power. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.